Hi, I'm Cruz Devon, and welcome to This Gay Life. Today we have a very special guest with us. She's an Australian lesbian playwright. Her name is Sandra Shotlander, and I'd like to introduce her right now. Hi, Sandra.
Hello, Cruz.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're from Australia, so...
That's right.
I mean, I know there's a lot more to you than that.
Yeah, I'm from Melbourne, which over here would be called Melbourne. And I began as a teacher, a high school teacher, but I ran away, let us say, from high school teaching to become an actor. Acting was my passion. And I went to England and did act in repertory companies, came back to Australia, fell back into teaching, and then formed my own theatre groups, and I became a director of the Plantagenets, which did school syllabus work. I also founded a theatre of the deaf, and that was called Mime and Mumbles, which was the name that the young deaf people gave it. And then in 1980-81, that was the watershed year for me. And it was that year that I came to the United States and I went to a writer's school up in Casanova in upstate New York. And it was at that stage that I had decided to concentrate, focus on writing. And that was the lesson that I was taught at the Women's Writers' Centre, to call myself a writer. And it was at that stage, I think, that I really cast the dice, cast my lot to become a playwright. And that's what I'm known as now.
Well, with actor, and you have a lot of other experiences too, to kind of blend in for your writing.
Total theatrical animal, in fact. I've done everything, from sweep the stage, sell the tickets, publicity, to write the plays, direct them, and to act as well. I still, in fact, do lots of readings of my work.
Tell us about some of your works that you've done.
Well, the year 1980 to 81 was certainly a watershed, and it was out of that year that I wrote the first play that I became known for, which was Framework. And that is it's a portrait of a relationship between two women, a lesbian relationship, and the stimulation, the inspiration for that came when I visited the Metropolitan Museum in 1980-81 in the February break of the writing school I went to. And in that museum, in a corner, a certain corner, I was looking for the portrait, Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, since Stein is a total hero of mine, if you like. And there she was, absolutely on the centre of the wall, in that famous portrait where she sits looking out at the audience, like a rock. Stein, of course, means stone, and there she is sitting like a rock. And she was looking over into the other corner, and when I followed her eyes, I saw Georgia O'Keeffe's Black Iris. Now, this is the huge head of an iris, and it's very vaginal. It's in most beautiful, deep purples to the rich, almost black centre. I think a lot of women particularly know it. In fact, a lot of lesbians have it hanging over in their bedrooms. So
You frequent lesbian bedrooms often, yes.
Well, I was bowled over by this black iris. I didn't know who Georgia O'Keeffe was at that stage, and so I immediately found out. And I mean, as an artist, she is so great that I was so bowled over that, in fact, I went to look for her house in New Mexico. I went on a pilgrimage to try to find her house.
It's kind of strange to be an O'Keeffe groupie, I guess.
Oh, but it was those two paintings and the juxtaposition of those two paintings with Stein looking into the iris that gave me the inspiration. And I looked at them for over an hour, and I thought, I am going to write a play set here with two women meeting in this corner, and that's all I knew. And a year later, I began that play, and it was Framework. And that is the play that first set me on the road to being a professional playwright, and it is my most often performed play as well.
Well, it's a very wonderful play. I mean, it talks in the subtleties of communication between women is just wonderful. I mean, I must say. By the way, anybody who's interested in actually reading the play, at the end of the show, we'll give you a chance to go ahead and find out where you can get a copy of the play. What's some other plays that you've written?
Well, that was followed up by Blind Salome, which takes a look at the ideas of Jung, Jung being the protege of Freud, so being the psychoanalyst, and his ideas of masculine and feminine. The idea that men are seeking the feminine in themselves, which is called the anima, and that women are seeking the masculine in themselves, called the animus. Now, this is a very intellectual idea, but the play actually explores 4 Australians in Assisi, and a psychiatrist called Christopher wants to be St. Francis, and he wants Bernice, the wife of his friend, to be his Sinclair adoring at his feet. Meanwhile...
The psychiatrist wants this, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And he wants to turn her into his vision of what she should be. And I see really Jung and Freud showing us their vision of what we as females are and what our unconscious is like as well. And so we are told by experts as females what our unconscious is like. And I think we have to create ourselves. And Blind Salome investigates this idea, but it's not just a play about theory, it's a play about people. And so these 4 Australians in Assisi, while Christopher is trying to seduce Bernice into his vision of her, i.e. Sinclair, and a literal seduction, of course, her husband actually falls in love with her sister. So it's just one of those usual sort of plots, really.
Rather twisted mass.
Yeah.
You had a play called Nancy, is that you?
Is that you, Nancy?
Is that you, Nancy?
That's
I'm
right.
sorry, I got it
Yes.
wrong. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's a real interesting concept for a play, as well as what's...
Yes. Yes,
wonderful.
it's a series of phone calls between 8 contemporary women. They're all sorting out their lives on the phone. And
which we all do on a daily basis.
Absolutely. One of those women, Patsy O'Brien, is writing a book called Strewn Poppies. Now, in Australia, there's an expression called tall poppies. These are people who succeed. These are the high flyers, tall poppies. Okay. And we delight, or Australians tend to delight in cutting them off. Yeah, it's called the tall poppy syndrome in Australia. And it's an unfortunate part of the Australian psyche, I think, to cut off tall poppies. But so these are strewn poppies. In other words, they're thrown by the wayside, knocked over, strewn. And Patsy O'Brien is writing about strewn poppies, and she wants to get through to Gertrude Stein to help her write. Gertrude Stein, who is in another dimension in the play, but she is trying to organise a dinner party of strewn poppies, in other words, out-of-power women. And so her phone calls are to Nancy Reagan, Maggie Thatcher. She's trying to get through to women who are out of power, because there's no use getting through to women in power because they are never available, because there are not enough of them to go around.
They're so busy.
Yes,
all the time.
That's right. So one of the phone calls in that begins, this is Patsy's actually, to her ex-lover, Cassie. They have transcended their sexual ties and taken their space, as she puts it. And that begins with no, she says, no, just a minute, Cassie, just a minute. Is that the Kathy of Kathy and Trish, or Kathy and Sue? the Sue who used to live with Jenny. Yes, Jenny of Jenny, Terry and Patty, who used to be with Barb of Susie and Barb and so on. And
which is the way we all talk on the phones. Nobody has any last names anymore. They just are coupled.
That's right. And I call that lesbian genealogy, in fact. I first wrote that. It was, I called that phone call a phone call in a common language. And I wrote that and then put it into Is That You, Nancy, and developed the character of Patsy. But I went to a lecture by a well-known Australian man called Donald Horne, who thinks of himself as one of our leading intellectuals and has written a book called Lucky Country, which was an important book on Australian ethos. Mm-hmm. And his lecture was entitled How to Be an Intellectual. And I thought this was going to be funny. But he was deadly serious, and he called for a common literary language. Well, when I thought of that, I thought a common literary language would be white, male, heterosexual, and middle class. Then, when I was on the telephone, is that the Kathy of having a good gossip, having a bit of a gossip, I then realised that this was a common language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's across the board, because I've heard that from people from other countries and all the way across America. It's very common.
And people here identify with that phone call. I know because I've read it around the States quite a lot. Yes. And in fact, Is That You, Nancy had a marvellous production in Salt Lake City last year in 1993. Theatre Works West did it. Fran Prynne, the director of Theatre Works West, made a bold step, and she took the play to the Sun Tavern, which is a gay bar in Salt Lake City, and it was just a sellout, complete sellout.
You would think that in some place like Salt Lake City it wouldn't be necessarily as, I don't know, a fruitful ground for that type, but although Salt Lake City does have a really good arts community.
Well, I sort of regard Salt Lake City almost as a patron, or let us say matron, city of mine. It's been, I've had 3 visits there now, and in the first visit, Rosemary Kerb and I read Framework. Mm-hmm. We did a reading of it, and the theatre department of Utah, University of Utah, did a stage reading of Blind Salome. And also I did seminars in the university. This time, then they did the production of Is That You, Nancy? Mm-hmm. And this year, on this tour, which I'm making with another Australian writer-performer, Sue Ingleton, we did performances, readings, workshops in Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City workshopped one of my newest plays called Waiting for Waves. Fran Prynne and actors from Theatre Works West, and also Richard Shrine from the University of Utah, workshopped Waiting for Waves, and then we did a public reading of it. Now this enabled me, it was a first draft they were working with, which is going to enable me to take it through to final draft.
Oh, that's wonderful. In case anybody is like semi-unfamiliar with Salt Lake City, they really do have a great arts community, and even though they may be considered to be in a rather religiously conservative area because of Mormonism, they really do support the arts, and so that is possible. I mean, just because there's a strong church hold in the area doesn't necessarily mean that the arts have to go by the wayside.
No, I found it remarkable. I mean, I have to say that when I first flew over Salt Lake City, I thought, I'll let the plane not crash here, because I mean, who knows? Could be burnt at the stake, who knows? Yeah. But I have found that there's an incredible artistic life in Salt Lake City, and that I have been very well received, extremely well.
Yeah, they've always had like many coffee houses and the ability to put new stuff on the air and put it out there in the public.
Yes, yes.
Which is something that would be nice to have a whole lot more in this area.
Yes,
hint,
yes,
hint.
yes.
Tell us a little bit more about your search for O'Keeffe. I mean, obviously you went out to go find her house.
I did. In 80-81, I tried to, wanted to get to her house, and I got to Santa Fe, but really there is no public transport out there. The only way would have been to hire a car, and at that stage I wasn't able to do that. So I wrote the play without having seen her house, but I saw the land, the desert around that area, and fell in love with it. And it was at that stage that I actually went back and explored our own desert.
The desert in Australia?
In Australia, and we too have a red land that is very beautiful. And last year, in 1990, I was actually able to get to O'Keeffe's house. It was a pilgrimage, and I was able to hire a car. I went there by myself, and I went to Aberquay, the village where she lives, and stood in the village square, and then like a total pilgrim stood at her fence.
Did you take some beads with you or something to pray on? Or no, I'm just teasing.
Left a gift, sort of, yes. I have these photos of O'Keeffe's fence. All you've got is this fence and foliage, trees. And I said, this is O'Keeffe's fence, to my friends. And they look and they say, oh, well, you know, that's lovely.
Like a fence.
It's a fence. But that's more or less all you could see. You can't go inside into the house. And of course, she died before I actually got there. But in a hotel, a pub, I actually met her telephone repairman. Oh, that was a moment in my life, I can tell you.
New heights in art.
Yes, yeah. But she was an inspiration to me. When I first staged the play, I had thought that the two paintings would be on the stage. And I wrote to O'Keeffe and asked if I could reproduce the Black Iris on the stage. Now, her secretary said that I would need to send the play, so I did. And she wrote back and said that the iris did not belong, her iris did not belong in my play. That was that. And I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to have to change it to a violet or a viola, but it just wasn't the same thing. And eventually I realised she had done me a favour, because we staged it with two empty frames, two huge perspex empty frames, and we lit them. The iris had a mauve light around it, and Stein had the brown-green light around her. And the empty frames, of course, were totally appropriate and much more exciting than having the paintings, so that people could use their imagination.
I think it's wonderful that you try to chase down O'Keeffe and
Yes.
some of the things that we do. You're on the advisory committee for the International Women's Playwright Conferences.
That's right.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I came to the first International Women Playwrights Conference in 1988 in Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo. It was directed by Anna K. France from SUNY Buffalo, and it was the idea of a very fine playwright, Kathleen Betzko, who now lives in Buffalo, has lived, in fact from Britain, from Coventry, now lives in Buffalo, has for many years. And there, 200 women came together from all over the world, 6 continents, about, 34 countries, something like that, to the first International Women Playwrights Conference. And if you could have harvested the energy at that conference, you could have changed the world. It was, for me, it was just such a giving of energy to me as a writer. And I think that all my trips to the States have preserved my sanity, really, because I realised that I'm not alone. In Australia, and I think in other parts of the country, women playwrights often work in isolation. But at these conferences, we come together. And I understood that there was a world network of women who wanted to change the world, were not going to be silenced at all any longer. And in the next one, the second International Women Playwrights Conference was in Toronto 3 years later, and then this year, 1994 July, the third International Women Playwrights Conference took place in Adelaide, Australia, South Australia, and it was a huge event. There were 500 to 600 people at any one forum.
Wow.
Or it was enormous. There were 3 forums in a day. There were at least 3 lots of readings. There were performances at night. There were workshops and information sessions as well. And women from 6 continents again, 34, 36 countries all around the world.
Do you think there's more women writers now than, say, there were maybe 6, 10 years ago?
Yes, I do, and I think it's always increasing. I think there always have been women writing, but now women are calling themselves writers, and they are making that their life's work. Not that it's an easy path, but I think that there are more opportunities, and there will be more and more.
Do you think a lot of that might have to do with, I mean, almost everybody I know, especially women, takes a journal or journalizes their life?
Yes.
And do you think the difference is that now women are finally putting it into a form that can be used, whether it's plays or novels or whatever, that can be bought and sold, put back and forth between people?
Yes, I do. I think that women are writing, they do write journals, and in the play form, what is very interesting from, and it's evident from the performances at the International Women Playwrights Conferences, is that women are writing one-woman shows based on their own lives. Now, this is, in the past probably, men would call this anecdotal. But now this has been given...
They would.
It's been given credence. And I think that women are developing their own style of telling their stories, often in a one-woman performance, because that is an economical way to do it, and they can get their stories out.
Well, there's been a whole proliferation of what's called movies, a woman's movie. But what it is, it's a woman's side of the story, or the woman writing the script for the movies and stuff.
That's right.
And
yes.
Whereas there's still a lot of, I see it at work a lot, is like, yeah, well, it's a real woman's movie. But now, finally, we're starting to get more and more scripts out there where people say, well, you might think of it as a woman's movie, but I really liked it. And I see that from both genders.
Well, anything, I suppose, that does not come from the male perspective would be called a woman's movie. That's right. And you find that something that is from a woman's perspective and putting women in the driving seat, putting them centre stage, will disrupt the space, the theatrical space, in a way, because people are used to seeing things from a male perspective, from the male writer. I mean, when we think about it, on the stage, it's not so far back in Shakespearean time and prior to that, that there weren't even women actors.
Yeah, that's right.
So the stage particularly has been a male domain, and which I think is why it's only more recently that there have been a proliferation of female writers, playwrights, directors.
Which is good, though. I mean, it's like finally we get to see ourselves on stage in a form that's a little bit more palatable and something we recognize. Yes,
yeah. There was a TV series that I think has come to the States called Brides of Christ, about a convent. And it was a very popular series in Australia, and I think it's been done over in the States as well. And one of the male actors in Brides of Christ went to the director and the producer and said that he felt a bit token.
Oh, poor thing.
No, he actually had a large part, but yes, but he felt as though he was not the protagonist in the show. And after talking a while, he said, well, look, you know, it's all right. I realised, he said, I am used to driving the bus, not being in the back seat. And
it's kind of tough sometimes.
And in what's called a woman's play or a woman's film, I think that's what happens, that the women take the main stage, they take centre stage, and it upsets some men.
Oh, the poor things.
Yes. Yes.
Oh.
But actually it's an enriching of the theatre, and it's actually balancing, of course, the terrible imbalance that has been on stage in the past.
And not to mention, we finally get to vocalize what we're feeling.
Well, as women, as lesbians, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, but we're starting. We're getting there.
There is a male gay genre on the stage, though, and Angels in America is a hit in Australia right at this moment, and I notice it is in the States as well. And I think that the male gay experience is much more acceptable. Could it be because it's male?
Well, one of the films that we had out here just recently was Priscilla, Queen of the Desert.
Yes.
And which was a hilarious film. And, you know, I suggest anyone who gets a chance, rent it at the video store when it comes out.
It's got that wacky Australian sense of humour. Yes.
Which took a while. It really had to get into. We just have a few minutes left. Actually, we probably only have like a few seconds left. I wanted to go ahead and let everybody know that if you would like a chance to go ahead and read some of Sandra's plays, we do have some. There are some that are available through the SMSU English department, and that should be up on the screen here. I have a telephone number if you'd like to get a copy of it. I believe it's $10.
That's right. And it has an introduction by
It's
Rosemary
very reasonable,
Kerb.
very reasonable. And it has an introduction by Rosemary Kerb. And so if you'd like to get a copy of that, you know, give them a call. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here on This Gay Life, and especially my guest, Sandra Shotlander.
Thank you, Cruz.
Join us again next week on This Gay Life. Thanks. I'm Cruz Devon.